You might if you move this, you're right.
Thank you very much for coming back. Gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today for the Clinker Lecture 2026, Graeme Bickerdike, who's been involved with railways for the last 30 years. Its involvement has taken her onto the track, given him an understanding of some of the structures that are involved, and he's got a website which
I don't mention it actually, but we could do. It's called Forgotten Relics, records and celebrates disused railway structures.
And he's also recently, a couple of months ago, published a book called Railway Wonders, which I think describes some of these 100 structures that he thinks very well worthwhile preserving. But anyway, he's going to tell us now about some of these structures that he's involved with and some of his efforts to keep them going.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Graeme Bickerdike. I'm a writer and campaigner with a long-standing interest in railway structures. Thank you for inviting me to give this year's Clinker Lecture, which will look at the value of legacy tunnels, viaducts and bridges, both as heritage assets and for their potential for future reuse as we transition to more sustainable forms of transport. Britain was the birthplace of the railways as we know them today. And last year, of course, saw the 200th anniversary of the opening of the Stockton and Darlington Railway. That reality gives both operational and disused railway assets particular historical importance as a physical reminder of our pioneering past. Many of the thousands of structures that became disused in the 1950s and 60s were hastily demolished in a demonstration of the power wielded by the road lobby at the time, but a sizable collection were sold to private companies or taken on by local authorities. In the 1980s, there were even plans to convert a number of disused tunnels into public shelters in the event of nuclear war. In the 90s, many disused viaducts were put up for sale with an asking price of just £1. Very few people took up the offer due to the potentially high level of associated liabilities. The 80s also saw the emergence of a movement which would eventually see around 2,000 miles of disused railways and the structures that accommodate them transformed into walking and cycling routes. The foundation stone of our national cycle network was laid by a group of campaigners who repurposed the Midland Railway's former line connecting Bath and Bristol, including the 515-yard Staple Hill Tunnel. But the first major railway repurposing was probably that of the narrow gauge Leek and Manifold Valley Light Railway, which closed in March 1934, but was reborn 3 years later after the LNS handed the trackbed over to Staffordshire County Council, including Swainsley Tunnel, which is now used by road traffic. Since the abolition of British Railways Board residuary in 2013, most of the structures that remained in the railway's ownership have become part of the Department for Transport's Historical Railways Estate, or HRE, as it's known, managed and maintained by the operator of the UK's strategic roads network, National Highways. The key service it provides, according to the protocol agreement between the two parties, is, quote, to seek to reduce the liabilities for the Secretary of State in terms of individual structure safety. There is no mention of recognising the historic, ecological, social or transport value of a structure when making asset management decisions. And yet, the government is committed to providing more high-quality infrastructure as it promotes active travel in the battle to improve both mental and physical health, whilst cutting carbon emissions. There can be no clearer demonstration of just how important these structures still are. And of course, there are aspirations in many parts of the country to see the reopening of railways for economic and connectivity reasons. The biggest obstruction to the repurposing of dismantled railways is the need to piece alignments back together again after being sold off piecemeal, blocked by inconsiderate development, or severed by the loss of structures. Maintaining the continuity of alignments should be a priority for any forward-looking public body. The Historical Railways estate comprises around 3,000 viaducts, many of which are listed. Approximately 70% of the structures are located in England, with Scotland hosting 18% and the remainder being in Wales. It would be fair to say that National Highways, or the Highways Agency as it then was, did not want responsibility for all these old railway structures, but the government imposed them on it, as at the time Network Rail was still technically in the private sector and therefore beyond the government's reach. In 2016, the Board of Highways England, which was the previous name for National Highways, was asked to consider a draft strategic plan for the long-term management of the Historical Railways estate. It asserted that the ongoing regime of, quote, delivering high volumes of low-cost reactive maintenance interventions has seen the HRE fall into an overall state of gradual deterioration. This approach is not sustainable in the longer term. Instead, it was proposed that a 10-year programme of proactive interventions be delivered, noting that, quote, the optimal option always removes or mostly reduces all future liabilities and mitigates the risk of reputational or financial harm to Highways England in each case. In terms of overbridges, the preferred and best option was perceived to be infilling. At the time, ongoing inspection, maintenance and assessment of a typical overbridge cost £25,000 every 10 years, whilst the price tag for infilling was £120,000 as a one-off capital expense. It would therefore take 48 years for an infill scheme to deliver financial benefit. The plan also identified a 10 to 15% reduction in the total number of HRE structures through a programme of demolitions. That loss would amount to as many as 480 structures. The obvious obstruction to delivery of the 10-year plan was cost, which was estimated at between 370 million and 560 million pounds. That's upwards of £37 million per year. In 2015-16, National Highways' budget for management of the HRE was less than a quarter of that, £7.8 million. Emails sent by the HRE engineering team in July 2018 indicate that progress was being made with development of the plan. Infill schemes at 2 bridges in Cumbria had been allocated to years 2 and 7 of the 10-year programme, with year 1 identified as 2020. Works on the Historical Railways estate were undertaken by 3 contractors, Amco Giffen, Balfour Beatty and Hammond ECS. But in the summer of 2020, it was revealed that National Highways had issued framework contracts to 6 companies for future works on the HRE, the original 3, plus Dyer and Butler, Bethel Construction and Beaver Bridges. The total headline value of the contract was £254 million over 7 years, an average of £36 million per year. This apparent 4-fold increase in its budget was being referred to by National Highways staff during discussions with its stakeholders in the summer of 2020. The company seemed convinced it was going to happen. By the end of 2020, National Highways had completed 45 bridge infill schemes over 7 years at a total cost of £6.7 million. Amongst the affected structures was a bridge at Chilcompton in Somerset, which was needed for an extension of a line operated by the Somerset and Dorset Railway Heritage Trust. That was infilled for £188,000, whilst Ridge Road Bridge near Shepton Mallet was infilled at a cost of £272,000, despite it being needed for an active travel route. So it was already apparent that the infill policy was having negative cost and delivery impacts on some sustainable transport proposals. Infilling is an engineering activity that changes the appearance of the affected structure, typically burying it in 2,000 tonnes of stone and concrete. Therefore, in the vast majority of cases, it constitutes development and is subject to the laws around development. Schemes bring with them environmental and ecological impacts, heritage loss, and remove any repurposing opportunities. Some structures have become embedded in the story of their communities and are appreciated as local assets. They can also be noteworthy features within the landscape. It's important that each infill scheme is subject to appropriate testing through the statutory planning process, whereby consultees can review proposals against relevant guidance and policies. Members of the public also get the chance to consider the plans and voice any concerns they might have. It's an important democratic right and important safeguard against damaging or inappropriate development. The evidence suggests that National Highways was gearing up for a considerable expansion of its HRE works programme. Not only was it securing additional capacity by expanding its contractor base, its consultant Jacobs was writing to local planning authorities for LPAs, fishing for consent to carry out more than 100 infill schemes under permitted development rights, whereby they go ahead on the basis of approval by planners without any stakeholder consultation or public scrutiny. The first substantive phase of this engagement began in the spring of 2020, when dozens of template letters were written to LPAs about specific bridges supposedly identified as having limited capacity. It was suggested that, quote, to prevent further deterioration of the bridge from occurring and remove the associated risk of structural collapse and harm to the public, it's proposed to infill the bridge to ensure the long-term stability of the bridge and road. By default, it was stated that, quote, the bridge is in poor condition with a significantly reduced load carrying capacity. Infilling the structure is considered necessary to prevent further deterioration and remove the risk of future collapse. It's worth noting that in many cases, inspection records actually recorded the bridges as being in fair condition, and some had been assessed as having sufficient capacity to carry all traffic conforming to authorised weight regulations. In other words, the letters were often a misrepresentation of the specific circumstances at the structure. References to partial potential collapse, where there was no prospect of one occurring, was clearly intended to heighten the level of risk perceived by the local planning authorities. There was no mention of applying for planning permission. Instead, the letters ended simply by stating, quote, we trust the above proposal is acceptable. We would like to obtain any general comments the council may have or details of any constraints that may be imposed on the works by the local authority. Then, on the 10th of September 2020, came a mail-out of 29 different template letters, which involved the systematic misapplication of permitted development rights relating specifically to temporary works in emergency situations. These rights are known as Class Q and are only applicable by the Crown in, quote, an event or situation which threatens, present tense, serious damage to human welfare or the environment, such as the loss of human life, injury, homelessness, or damage to property. The land, or the structure in this case, must be restored to its original condition before the development took place within 12 months of the work starting, unless written consent for retention beyond that limit was granted by the local planning authority, which, according to government guidance, should be obtained through a retrospective planning application. The rights are intended for unilateral application by the developer, National Highways in this case, in events such as environmental emergency threatening pollution of the foreshore. There is no mechanism or need for approval by the local planning authority. The developer's only obligation is to inform the LPA of what they've done as soon as possible after work has begun. In relation to the 29 structures subject to Class Q letters, the recipient local planning authorities were told in each case that National Highways intended to carry out, quote, planned support works via structural infill because, quote, the structure represents an ongoing and increasing risk to public safety. The letter concluded by stating that, quote, specifically and for the avoidance of any ambiguity, the works are being undertaken in order to prevent an emergency arising. One of the 29 structures was located near Saltash in Cornwall and spanned the original alignment of the Cornwall Railway, a route engineered by Isambard Kingdom Brunel. The bridge had never been subject to a capacity assessment because it doesn't carry a public road. The nearest right-of-way is about 200 yards away. It actually carries a farm track. Tyre tracks in the grass would suggest that it's used occasionally by vehicles with a relatively narrow wheelbase. The bridge exhibits no meaningful defects and none is mentioned in the letter, which states only that, quote, the structure is in a deteriorating condition with damp and calcite deposits throughout the arch barrel. There is standing water beneath the bridge. It's difficult to understand how the bridge, quote, represents an ongoing and increasing risk to public safety, and in what context, quote, works are being undertaken in order to prevent an emergency arising. In reality, this was a remote, low risk and attractive structure with some historical value through its links with Brunel. Also amongst the 29 emergency infills was Horsebatch Bridge near Wells in Somerset. This structure was intended for reuse as part of the Strawberry Line Greenway. A member of the group developing the route became aware of the infilling proposal and the exploitation of Class Q to push it through. They discussed the issue with an associate who was aware of National Highways' likely works budget increase and had long-standing concerns about the company's management of the HRE. Collectively, they felt that the potent combination of significant additional funding and Class Q could result in what one of them described as, quote, a scorched earth policy, whereby hundreds of heritage assets with value for active travel could be lost, leaving planned schemes across the country with blockages on their route that will be impractical to remove given the shoestring funding for such schemes. These two individuals joined forces with a third active travel advocate to form the HRE group, intended to highlight the value of legacy railway structures in the context of active travel. I was recruited to take the campaign forward, engaging with the media, stakeholders, and relevant political bodies. Our first task was to understand the extent of the threat. So a request was submitted to National Highways under the Freedom of Information Act. This revealed plans at various stages of development to infill 115 bridges and 4 tunnels, as well as demolishing 15 structures. 10 were already subject to planning applications. The intention with the remaining 124 was to pursue the schemes either under unspecified permitted development rights, if consent was granted by the relevant local planning authority, or under Class Q as an emergency scheme. Desktop analysis of these 134 structures carried out by our group found that 25% had immediate value for a proposed transport scheme, be it an active travel route, a railway reopening, or extension to a heritage line. 13% had identified value to be useful in the future, and 33% presented no practical obstructions to future reuse. The remaining 29% had no obvious value. These findings were similar to those contained in a study of HRE structures within National Highways Major Works Programme completed by Sustrans on the Department for Transport's behalf in 2022. On this basis, it was clear that the threat was real and substantial. When the HRE Group's campaign launched publicly in January 2021, National Highways made clear that, quote, "We're planning to infill 115 bridges and remove 15 structures over the next 5 years, suggesting that there will be a second phase of works as part of their 10-year plan." Explaining the reasons behind the programme, it stated that, quote, "Around 200 of the public road bridges managed by Highways England have failed their most recent structural assessment, BD21, but haven't had any weight restrictions implemented. Therefore, our planned infilling is the safest and most appropriate option and will maintain access across the structure." This suggested that the eventual extent of the programme would comfortably exceed 200 structures, as many of the bridges earmarked for infilling in the first phase did not meet this criteria, having passed a BD21 assessment or already being subject to a weight restriction. Our analysis, again based on evidence sourced under the Freedom of Information Act, suggested that at least 228 bridges could be affected. At that time, BD21 was the standard against which highway bridges were assessed in terms of capacity. Broadly, the requirement is for a highway bridge to carry a vehicle weighing 40 tonnes. However, as most HRE structures were built before 1922, the obligation on national highways is to meet the requirements of a legacy standard, BE4, which requires it to deliver a live loading capacity of around 24 tonnes on the carriageway. In other words, excluding the pavements and verges. If a local highway authority needs an HRE bridge to carry more than 24 tonnes, it has the responsibility to fund and deliver the strengthening works, not National Highways. The first few months of our campaign were focused on engagement with statutory bodies such as Historic England, whose biennial report on the care of the government historical estate rated National Highways as the worst of the 20 departments and agencies with responsibility for looking after publicly owned heritage assets, scoring just 40 out of 100, although its performance has since improved somewhat. We also had meetings with the chair of the all-party parliamentary group for cycling and walking and members of the House of Commons Transport Committee, the latter being instrumental in challenging National Highways through government ministers over the impact and reasons for its infilling and demolition programme. But it was arguably through the media that the battle for hearts and minds was won, with 20,000 members of the public signing a petition aimed at ensuring that no structure was put beyond use without a thorough assessment of its broader value. By spring 2021, it became clear that National Highways' anticipated budget increase was not happening, and the company told the Daily Telegraph that, quote, only 69 structures will be infilled along with 15 demolitions between now and 2030. The extent to which this change was influenced by our campaign is not clear. Notwithstanding all this activity, National Highways was pushing ahead with its infilling programme, and in April 2021 completed schemes under emergency permitted development rights at a highly skewed masonry arch in North Yorkshire dating back to the 1840s, and a rare surviving example of an early modular concrete bridge in Norfolk. But it was a project in Cumbria that brought the matter to national attention, attracting vociferous criticism from engineers, politicians, the media, and anyone with an appreciation of our railway heritage. Reputational damage was self-inflicted on National Highways as it contrived to force through a wholly unnecessary scheme without any engagement with invested stakeholders. Is there a glass of water? 1 second. The 22-mile Eden Valley Railway was effectively a branch of the Transpennine, South Durham and Lancashire Union Railway, which was built to transport iron ore from Cumberland and Lancashire to the blast furnaces of the northeast, whilst coal and coke went the other way from the mines of County Durham to the northwest of England. It opened in 1862. Both lines were engineered by Sir Thomas Bouch, whose career was brought to a premature end with the collapse of the first Tay Bridge on the 28th of December 1879, for which he was largely blamed. The Eden Valley Railway remained intact until November 1975, serving a quarry near Kirby Stephen, but fully closed in 1989. Since then, heritage operations have been established at Warcop and at Kirby Stephen East by the Eden Valley Railway and Stainmore Railway Company, respectively. The ambition of relaying the 5 miles of track between them is long-standing, but complicated by the loss of the 3-span viaduct over the River Eden to the south of Musgrave Station. It is, however, something both groups are working towards, and they believe their efforts will eventually deliver a much-needed boost to the economy of an overlooked part of the Eden Valley. Nobody is in any doubt about the challenges to be faced, but the officers and volunteers involved deserve to be encouraged. About 150 yards north of Musgrave Station, the B6259 passed over the railway on a masonry arch known as EDE25 or Great Musgrave Bridge, which was built with stone thought to have come from a red sandstone quarry near Clibborn, 14 miles away. There was nothing exceptional about the structure, but it was an attractive and sympathetic addition to the landscape. In 1998, Cumbria County Council, as the local highway authority, completed a BD21 assessment of the bridge, concluding that it had a capacity of just 17 tonnes, largely as a consequence of open joints in the arch barrel. It recommended that the open joints were repointed, in which event the bridge would pass BD21 and be suitable for 40-tonne vehicles. In 2022, Bill Harvey Associates, a firm of masonry arch bridge specialists, reviewed the assessment and found that factors assigned to profile and condition were overly conservative, resulting in an unrealistic outcome to the calculations. In other words, the BD21 failure was effectively a function of subjective choices made by the engineer. If more appropriate factors had been selected, the bridge would have comfortably passed its assessment. In March 2012, the bridge was repointed by British Railways Board residuary for £10,645, restoring it to 40 tonnes capacity. An updated BD21 assessment should have been carried out at this time to reflect the new circumstances, but no such work took place. In August 2017, the bridge's 6-yearly detailed examination recorded a small number of open joints in the arch and a slight deflection of stone blocks in the crown region. Such defects are commonplace in masonry arch bridges. Mortar is often washed out of joints as water finds a means of escape, and the sagging of stonework often occurred during the construction period when the timber centering upon which the arch is assembled was removed. These minor defects were not a cause for concern. Generally, the condition of Great Musgrave Bridge remained fair, with no evidence of defects associated with overloading and no evidence of any meaningful deterioration. But that's not how National Highways saw it. In 2019, its engineers added the bridge to a list of infill candidates on the basis of what was perceived to be, quote, ongoing deterioration, of which there was no evidence. Jacobs wrote to the planning team at Eden District Council on the 23rd of April 2020, citing the failed BD21 capacity assessment from 1998 and claiming that, quote, to prevent further deterioration of the bridge from occurring and remove the associated risk of structural collapse and harm to the public, it's proposed to infill the bridge to ensure the long-term stability of the bridge and road. Eden District Council responded the following day, stating that in its view, the works, quote, would constitute permitted development works to maintain the highway, and that, quote, we don't consider that we would need to see a planning application for these works. The scheme was effectively sanctioned without any scrutiny of its impacts by stakeholders or statutory consultees. The list of 134 structures earmarked for infilling or demolition, sourced from National Highways under the Freedom of Information Act, included an entry for Great Musgrave Bridge, but there was no indication as to when the work might take place. The scheme was simply described as developing. The timescale became apparent to the two heritage railways when one of their volunteers drove over the bridge on Monday, the 24th of May 2021, only to find that contractor Amco Giffen was establishing a compound in the adjacent field. Faced with the prospect of their long-standing ambition of reunification being blocked by 1,600 tonnes of stone and concrete, the railways made representations to local councillors who contacted the planning team at Eden District Council. Musgrave Parish Council had also not been informed of the works, leading to anger and frustration within the local community, where the bridge was valued as a historical asset. It soon became apparent that the council's previous consent to the scheme, carried out as permitted development, was a mistake, having been decided upon by a relatively junior member of the planning team. Enforcement officers were dispatched to the bridge the following day. Amco Giffen's first week on site was taken up with preparatory works. Meanwhile, much email traffic was passing between the council and National Highways. Matters came to a head on Friday, the 28th of May, when a planning officer made clear to National Highways engineer that, quote, we're looking to make an assessment as to whether these works constitute permitted development or whether planning permission should be sought. As such, we would ask that you do not commence the works until such time as we have made this assessment. But instead of conceding to this request, the engineer responded that, quote, We consider the works to be permitted development as they will prevent a future collapse and preserve public safety under Class Q. On this basis, I am not going to ask the contractor to stop works. By unilaterally invoking Class Q, the engineer was effectively deeming the works to be temporary and essential to prevent an emergency. But this was clearly not the case. He didn't know it at the time, but his response would result in the worst possible outcome for National Highways, causing its entire house of cards to come crashing down. Whilst the works continued, opposition to them became more vocal and impassioned, with National Highways actions coming under much attention and criticism. Its senior HRE engineer wrote to the local highways authority asking, quote, "Would you mind dropping us a note saying that you support the works to infill the bridge, please?" The reply came back, quote, "In this case, it would appear that repointing would have been adequate to achieve full highway loading," and quote, "I wasn't aware that the infilling of the bridge had started, and I was surprised that you hadn't contacted me to confirm this." National Highways then claimed that it had engaged with both Heritage Railways about its infilling plans for the bridge, telling the Daily Mail that, quote, "They'd approached both Eden Valley and Stainmore Heritage Railway companies who'd confirmed that there were no immediate plans for a Heritage Railway link at Great Musgrave due to the missing river bridge further along the line." However, this statement was not true. National Highways had not engaged with either group about Great Musgrave Bridge, and the two railways wrote a joint letter of complaint to National Highways chief executive, asking the company to, quote, "provide us with details of where, when, and with whom this alleged meeting took place." National Highways' response contained a number of misrepresentations, including a claim that the council had not asked it to pause the works until they were, quote, "substantially complete." This was clearly not true. On the 16th of June 2021, as part of my campaign duties, I met concerned locals at 3 bridges in Northumberland and Dumfries and Galloway. My route home took me within a mile of Great Musgrave Bridge, so I took the opportunity to see how the works were progressing. It happened to be on the day when the contractor had poured concrete under the arch. At 1:06, I took a photograph that changed the course of the campaign. The concrete had overflowed down a bank of stone and pooled on the old track bed. In it were the footprints of a squirrel. An attractive stone bridge valued by the community had been transformed into an eyesore. The photo demonstrated the brutal nature of infilling and its obvious environmental impacts. It suggested a lack of respect for our railway heritage. And yet, according to Richard Marshall, then National Highways HRE director, quote, "Through our work, we have preserved the structure." It was a crass comment and indicative of a company that was totally out of step. When we published the photo 2 days later, the response was overwhelming. Members of the Institution of Civil Engineers expressed shame and embarrassment at National Highways actions, stating that they brought the profession into disrepute. On the 5th of July, Lord Faulkner of Worcester led a debate on the issue in the House of Lords. And then on the 29th of July came the news that the government had stepped in to halt National Highways' infilling and demolition programme due to concerns over its misalignment with policies promoting active travel. The stone and concrete embankments at Great Musgrave Bridge were cosmetically dressed with topsoil and seeded with grass, but the work was carried out so badly that more than 2 months after the infill scheme had been completed, its appearance remained unsightly. In an email exchange with planning officers on the 24th of June, National Highways engineer attempted to explain why the situation at the bridge was compliant with the requirements of Class Q, asserting that, quote, the bridge was being overloaded and works were required to prevent the failure of the bridge and avert a collapse. However, there was no evidence to support this evaluation, and the report from Bill Harvey Associates described it as, quote, preposterous. National Highways conceded that without written consent from the council to retain the infill beyond the maximum 12-month period allowed under Class Q, it would have to seek planning permission, and the application was submitted in March 2022. By the time members of the council's planning committee convened to determine the application on the 16th of June, 911 people had submitted objections to the infill's retention, whilst only 2 representations were received in support of it. One of those came from the director of a charity called Railway Paths Limited, which owns the trackbed and a number of structures between Warcop and Appleby. At the planning committee meeting, it became clear that National Highways was proposing to spend £450,000 of taxpayers' money refurbishing structures owned by Railway Paths if the committee accepted the application to retain the infill at Great Musgrave Bridge. However, councillors were not swayed by this sweetener, voting unanimously to refuse it. Eden District Council's Assistant Development Director, Fergus McMorrow, said that infilling had caused, quote, considerable harm to the visual appearance of the bridge and, quote, fails to complement or enhance the area to protect features or characteristics of local importance. In a media statement, Helen Rossiter, the head of National Highways Historical Railways Estate, made clear that the company would, quote, no longer consider the infilling of any structures as part of our future plans unless there is absolutely no alternative. But National Highways has since withdrawn this commitment without publicising it. Eden District Council issued an enforcement notice on the 9th of September 2022, requiring removal of the infill by the 11th of October 2023. Without any consultation with the local community, the road over the bridge was closed for 13 weeks whilst the infill was removed, causing great inconvenience and some financial loss to local people, farms and businesses. The stone and concrete is now stockpiled 60 metres north of the bridge with the consent of the landowner, once again blocking the former railway trackbed. For 2 years, ever since the initial scheme was completed, National Highways had claimed that the bridge would have to be strengthened if support from the infill was removed. However, a new assessment found that Great Musgrave Bridge passed the successor standard to BD21 with only minor repointing and repairs to the damage caused by breaking out the infill. It was found to have what's called a minimum adequacy factor of 3.43. In effect, this meant that it now had a capacity of around 137 tonnes without additional strengthening. The infill scheme had no engineering justification, and the £124,000 of taxpayers' money spent on it was completely wasted. On the 2nd of August 2021, in response to a parliamentary question, a government minister asserted that in the event of a need to remove the infill, quote, the estimated cost is £30,000. If the material can be reused to form a walking path, then it's more likely to be £10,000. By the time National Highways carried out a review of the infill scheme 2 months later, the potential cost had risen to between £80,000 and £90,000. The actual cost of removing the infill was £352,000. £100,000. It's worth noting that at the public inquiry into the emergency infilling of the early modular concrete bridge in Norfolk, which National Highways had persistently claimed was needed because of condition and capacity concerns, the company's barrister admitted that National Highways had formed, quote, a mistaken view about the scope and applicability of Class Q in this case, and that, quote, safety or load carrying capacity was not the main motivation for the infill scheme. It was carried out instead because of perceived long-term cost savings, although no alternative approach to managing the issues presented by the bridge had ever been costed. We have no reason to believe the infilling of Great Musgrave Bridge was motivated by different factors. So, where are we now? We'll just have another. So, where are we now? As a condition for lifting the pause on its major works programme, the government required National Highways to put in place, quote, a formalised framework and engagement process for these structures to understand in each case whether there is a realistic prospect of it being used for active travel or other transport purposes in the future, and to ensure that the views of local stakeholders, including active travel groups and the local authority, are fully taken into account. To that end, a stakeholder advisory forum, or SAF, was set up initially with input from the Department for Transport, the client, Sustrans, Railway Paths, the charity I just mentioned, and the Railway Heritage Trust, all of whom are closely aligned and in some cases financially supported by National Highways. The HRE group is also a member. At our suggestion, Historic England, Natural England, and the Heritage Railway Association were subsequently invited to take part. The SAF is consulted if major works are proposed to a structure where infilling or demolition is a possibility, reviewing the various options and considering any potential negative impacts. A recommendation is then offered. However, it would still be for the engineer to actually make the decision. If infilling or demolition is selected, sign-off is now required from the government's Minister for Roads, within whose portfolio the Historical Railways estate resides. By default, National Highways has also committed to seeking planning permission for all future infill schemes. It will not again exploit Class Q unless there is a genuine emergency. Underpinning this new approach is a revised protocol agreement with the Department for Transport, which, when formally implemented, will require National Highways, quote, to seek to explore all opportunities for repurposing and reusing assets within the estate, and, quote, to work with partner organisations to carefully consider the ecology and heritage implications of works alongside opportunities to support partner organisations to reuse the estate for good in creating new or additional active travel rail or heritage rail routes. So far, 20 structures have been placed before the SAF, most of which could reasonably be described as having lower value, with infilling subsequently confirmed as the preferred option in 9 cases, and demolition in 7 cases. Varying levels of uncertainty remain over the other 4. Work on the completed schemes began in autumn 2024, but we do not anticipate another assault as egregious as Great Musgrave or any of the other emergency schemes which promise to scupper the positive efforts of many good people who wanted to bring new life to structures for the benefits of their communities. National Highways has upped its game in terms of public relations and is actively promoting the sympathetic refurbishment schemes it carries out each year to some of its bridges, tunnels, and viaducts. There's also engagement with active travel advocates, particularly in the southwest, with a view to helping the development of new routes. However, National Highways' public commitment to remove the infill from one span of Ridge Road Bridge to allow an extension of the Strawberry Line Greenway has still not been delivered almost 3 years after it was made. What's also unclear is whether there's been a culture change amongst the National Highways engineers who've been bruised by scrutiny and criticism over recent years, but still seem reluctant to recognise value by default in the structures they look after. The lens reviews produced to inform members of the Stakeholder Advisory Forum about major works proposals sometimes miss vital insight in terms of heritage, ecology, and repurposing potential, and are sometimes subjectively and financially skewed in favour of infilling or demolition. This reality is highlighted by the vexed issue of Queensbury Tunnel, arguably the most strategically valuable structure within the historical railways estate. At 1.4 miles in length, it connects Bradford District with Calderdale and has been promoted by local campaigners as a potential centrepiece of a greenway network which would deliver £3 in social, economic and tourism benefits for every £1 invested, according to a recent feasibility study. According to the government, that is high value for money. Between 2018 and 2021, £7.3 million of public money was spent on strengthening and stabilisation works, making the tunnel safe for future reuse. But last summer, a government minister committed a further £7.5 million to an abandonment scheme, which would see around 6% of the tunnel infilled and the rest left to collapse. The minister who made this decision was presented with evidence which exaggerated the safety risks and repair costs associated with the structure and downplayed its potential benefits and importance as a transport and heritage asset. So the direction of travel is towards abandonment, but the works require planning permission, to which more than 8,100 people have already objected. So whilst we are in a better place generally, the shenanigans around Queensbury Tunnel demonstrate ongoing causes for concern. The harm already inflicted on dozens of structures remains an obstruction to progress with some sustainable transport schemes, and the willingness of a public body to exploit permitted development rights unlawfully is a reality that should concern us all. The custodians of our great railway heritage have a duty to treat it with respect, secure the noteworthy parts of it for future generations to enjoy, and to ensure it retains the potential to play a role in our battle against climate change and poor health. In that context, our public bodies must take the lead, but sometimes seem reluctant to do so. We need to encourage them to see the light. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Graeme. That's a fascinating talk. As a society, we tend to be interested in the history of 18th and 19th century structures, and this, because it's been recorded, will effectively an archive of 21st century structures being reused effectively. So that is something I think too, the societies will.
Unhelpful.
Oh dear.
Don't worry, it's only water.
So this caused me one or two thoughts. So after the first question, if you're willing to answer the question.
Anything you like.
There's an ongoing case at the moment in Edinburgh of a route of an old railway which has been reused for a public footpath. Now that the Edinburgh Corporation wanted to reopen a new line for a tramway, that is one of the options. And of course, the local residents who have become accustomed to using that footpath are not very happy about it. So there is always this grey area, I suppose. So how do you assess the future reuse? Certainly, the Steinborn you were talking about, that is an ongoing aspiration, I suppose, of local people. But there must be plenty of other examples which are not known. Equally, are we being realistic and expecting the river bridge at Great Musgrave ever to be rebuilt? So what are your thoughts, please, on some of those issues?
In terms of the river bridge at Great Musgrave being rebuilt, I sort of share the scepticism that's generally felt that it's the kind of project that would generally be beyond a volunteer organisation such as the Stainmore Railway Company or Eden Valley Railway. But it's worth noting, I think, it's worth noting two things. Firstly, particularly the Stainmore Railway Company have a collection of volunteers who are doing some absolutely remarkable things. If you ever get a chance to go to Kirby Stephen East Station, I would really recommend that you do so. Their preservation of rolling stock is exemplary. They've just rebuilt a signal box. They're doing some great work on signalling system, and they've also just repaired 3 bridges further up the line. So these small organisations are capable of doing remarkable things because they're so invested in delivering benefits. Other heritage railways, the bigger heritage railways, North Yorkshire Moors Railway, for example, have a track record of doing major infrastructure works. I certainly reported on a bridge replacement they did 5 years ago. They're doing another one now. So I think where there is a will, there is a way is a sort of motto that I think many heritage railways would probably buy into. It would be great to see those 2 railways in Cumbria reconnected because it would make such a difference economically to that part of the world. It's a rather overlooked part of the Eden Valley. In terms of your broader point, I mean, I'm not familiar with the situation you cite in Edinburgh. It's not beyond the bounds of possibility for active travel routes and railway schemes to sit side by side. And certainly there are plenty of examples on the continent where active travel routes have been laid alongside railways. But it's a question of assessing the benefits and making a choice. I can absolutely understand why local communities would want to retain an asset they've had and enjoyed for many years. If the local authority believes that actually there's greater benefit to the wider region by putting a tram system under a bridge, then that's a matter for them. But the key is, as was clear from Great Musgrave, the key is there needs to be local consultation, and you need to take people with you. Imposing solutions that do not meet the needs of local communities is rarely a good idea.
I should add, by the way, I used to use the B6259 before the M6 was built from Lancaster to Carlisle. It was one alternative route to get to between those 2 points. And I fully support the aspiration to reuse that building. So can I just explain that we have the benefits of modern technology? The owl here is a 360-degree camera. It picks up whoever is talking and focuses on them. So please, any further questions for Graeme?
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I should declare an interest for a member of the Stainmore Railway Company. But I'm more interested in some of the structural aspects of this. Highways England, of course, was the original name for
Highways Agency before it became Highways England.
Indeed. And that organisation did not have a remit in either Scotland or Wales, as I understand it.
Not in terms of legacy railway structures. Their management of the legacy railway structures, historical railways estate, extends throughout Britain. It's not just England.
Yeah. But
in terms of the strategic roads network, National Highways is England only. But in terms of the HRE, it's both.
That was my point, though. It extended. the scope of what is otherwise a purely English arrangements. The thought occurs to me, would it now be possible with railways built before Parliament to pass the responsibility for the historic estate back where it belongs, which is
with the railway.
Great British Railways?
The position of the HRE group, campaign group that I'm part of, has from its inception been, these are railway structures, they will be much better off being managed by an organisation that has deep expertise and a higher level of resources than a small team of 7 or 8 engineers buried within National Highways, with all the sort of cultural issues that come with a state-owned roads company who regard a structure that was built in the 1950s as being very, very old indeed. So I think there is a case, and there are ongoing issues. I sort of alluded to some of them. There are ongoing issues with National Highways management of the estate to a point where we are sort of teetering on the brink of writing to the minister and writing to the Transport Committee, restating our view that that's what needs to happen. The Labour manifesto said we will unify the railway, bring its various component parts together. We don't see any reason why that should not include the 3,000 legacy structures that form part of the historical railways estate.
If I may make a further point, Great Musgrave is probably a good example, as River Thames Island was it before it. If you look at the benefits in terms of tourism pounds could be to a neglected part of Cumberland of reunifying those two embryonic railway schemes,
Yes.
then I have no doubt we would get a return which is considerably more than the average scheme.
Yes, I don't think there's any doubt.
The need for regeneration benefits in that area.
Yeah, I mean, so you'll know Mike Thompson then,
Yeah.
of course, and Mike Thompson is the project manager of the Stainmore Railway Company, and he's very clear about, you know, that part of the Eden Valley needs this project to succeed. It's not going to be easily delivered. It's going to be costly. It's going to be time consuming. But the long-term prosperity of that part of Cumbria is to some extent going to rely on enterprises like that Heritage Railway coming to fruition and delivering those tourism there.
And indeed the relief.
Can we move on, please? Nick?
Yeah, I just want to support that, but I'm sort of standing up so the outro can see me.
I'm looking forward to see the slow motion replay.
Because you've been standing so close, we've got some very good pictures of your belt up in that.
Oh, excellent. Excellent.
I just want to reinforce the point, and I'm sorry if this is history revisiting itself, but about 40 years ago, I was a railway civil engineer, primarily involved with track, but one of the adjuncts of my job was what I would call second tier bridge examination and assessment. And at that time, structures on abandoned railways, as we used to call them, were managed by the British Rail Property Board, who may have had a similar view of life to the Highways Agency. But the inspection of bridges on abandoned railways were, as it were, outsourced by the British Rail Property Board to the British Rail Civil Engineers, who were also responsible for the live railway, and therefore looked at these structures in much the same way as structures still carrying traffic. So every 7 years, the first line inspection was carried out, which was a technician inspection, if you like, an artisan inspection to proceed pro forma. If that found anything that was a bit untoward, it passed to the second tier, which was the local, as it was called at the time, area civil engineer, you know, people like me, we used to go and have a look and, poke around a bit and kick the tires, as it were. And by and large, the answer was pretty much as Ryan's mentioned with Musgrave, which was, well, yeah, it's 120 years old. What do you expect? It's still capable of doing what it was supposed to do, give or take the odd bit of pointing and perhaps the occasional restriction. Come back in another 7 years and we'll have another go. And that was the way it carried on. I don't want to write on too long, but I sort of think then inspections were carried out by railway engineers. It was very, very early days of Health and Safety at Work Act. We didn't perceive that if we made the wrong decision, we might end up going to jail. But pretty much we didn't. Nowadays you've got to ask yourself, what's the incentive for anybody? And I'm not defending Jacobs for 1 minute, taking other than a very conservative view. They're being paid by Highways England. Give the wrong advice, they might not get their contract renewed when it's up for grabs after 5-7 years. If they make an engineering decision that turns out to be wrong and there's a collapse or something like that, they get sued. Professional indemnity insurance and so on. There is absolutely no incentive for any consultant to do other than take a highly conservative view of the world. It's just not in their interests. So they don't. I think putting the responsibility back to Network Rail with a remit that says you will treat these structures exactly the same as you treat your own structures, and there will be some form of independent review every now and again to make sure you're doing it, would be the right thing to do, because it puts the expertise with the people who know what they're doing. If you think training and experience is expensive, just think of the cost of ignorance, and that's sort of where you end up in this situation.
Yeah. David Blackburn, former British Waterways civil engineer. And Graham's presentation, I think, highlights splendidly a failure of corporate memory in HM government. We're looking back to the canal situation, where in the 70s, 80s, the old British Waterways had a canal redevelopment team whose job was to fill in canals. And then things changed, and the impossible happened. Spanish Tunnel and the Huddersfield Canal, Rochdale Canal were restored, so that the three-span viaduct of the rivers, is possible in the future. Right, the presentation was highlighted. The government have got it wrong and needs shaking up, which really is with. Thank you.
One over here.
Just to make a point, because in my professional career, I was involved in the shallow water scheme for the Rochdale Canal in the 1970s, when we were laughed at for what we did. But what we did do was retain all the infrastructure buried, but all the lock chambers, etc. And if you told me in the 70s that within my lifetime, I'd actually ride on a boat through Newton Heath, we would have laughed ourselves silly. Yet only 20 years later, the entire Rochdale Canal and the Manchester section was in much better condition than most of it. Was navigable, and I have navigated through it. So it's certainly foolish to dismiss the prospects for any of these linear routes reviving in some useful form.
Have you got any information on the London Tunnel? I was within a mile of it a couple of weeks ago due to heavy rain. I think they were to have a look on about the opening.
I've been into Rhondda Tunnel 3 times, I think, in relatively recent times. They've got planning permission to excavate the Blind Cwm portal, so the northeast end.
Yeah.
And they are working on a planning application for the southwest end. And they are currently raising funds to carry out the excavation of Blind Cwm. It's such an obvious one to do, because it connects two valleys that are desperately badly connected, and it's part of the world which obviously is so deprived with the loss of coal mining, and to sort of re-energize that part of the world through tourism and to offer a resource like that, it's a no-brainer, and I've absolutely no doubt it will happen. The problem they're experiencing is that they can't do anything whilst it's owned by the Department for Transport, because the Department for Transport won't let them. So there has to be another custodian found for it. How that impasse will end up being overcome, that's not clear yet. But you know, their campaign's been going on for more than 10 years. And I suspect it would have been opened by now were it not for the Department of Transport.
John,
You talk about large scale projects on that, going back over the road river there. That surely is absolutely nothing compared with the Great Central's one at the moment, joining the two up. But the other comment I did hear some while ago, consider the canals in Birmingham. More vandalism to them has been done by officialdom than all the villains of this world there are. Which is, and again, go back to Huddersfield. They said, no, never, ever,
Couldn't be done.
ever used for someone.
Yeah. It's inexplicable that we cannot recognise that existing infrastructure must have a value as we transition into not the same reliance on motor cars. You know, it's breathtaking that we don't have value by default in the things we already have. But unfortunately, there is a sort of mental block in some parts of the public sector, I'm afraid.
I don't see there's any mental then. But the other one is some years ago now, I was over at I don't know, somewhere in the West Coast main line over in Cheshire, and they were bringing a big transformer across from Stafford. They had to reverse half a mile or more reverse from the route they were using to go over the original bridge from when they built the line, because the new one won't take it. Hang on a minute, there's something wrong there, isn't there?
Yeah.
And in fact, I've heard the same somewhere over towards Angola. They have to take the locomotive to the Angola. They actually have to go over the old bridge down the bottom, because the big, bright, shiny new thing won't take it. Something wrong with that in my thoughts.
I think there was some problem to my mind as a civil engineer in some of the structures you were talking about. Congham, for instance, early 20th century concrete structure might have serious problems in the long term, whereas a masonry arch bridge, as you were saying, could last forever effectively with a bit of repointing. So any more questions, please? No, back at the back.
There's more of a comment. Do you think that what we really need is some sort of academic qualification in terms of heritage engineering, so that the engineers we have understand how all the structures were built, and we lose a lot of that expertise as people get older?
We are losing that expertise, and my understanding when we started the campaign, because I was asking the same question, is that civil engineering degrees do not generally look at historical structures. They tend to be focused on this is how you build a new structure, rather than this is how you maintain. Is that reasonable? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, self-evidently, these structures need to be maintained by people who have the experience and competence to do so effectively. And if that's not happening, and given something I experienced last week, I don't think it is happening always, then something needs to happen. But I don't know how you, maybe it's somebody for the Institution of Civil Engineers to be pushing, and maybe they are, but self-evidently what you're saying is correct.
It was the reason that I translated the first sort of book on canal engineering, is it gave an insight that you couldn't get any other way.
No, I think you've made that point before, Mike, many times.
Just going back to the Musgrave situation, in this gravel infill with a concrete slurry over the top. I might be wrong, I'm not a civil engineer, but surely the gravel infill compacts over time, so you're not actually having the full supply.
No, I'm smiling because you. What?
Actually fill the void, therefore you've had to square one.
12 months after they complete an infill, they go back and they core through the road at the crown to see whether there is any settlement and a gap. The structure I showed at Ridge Road Bridge near Shepton Mallet, which was a 3-span structure, they did that 12 months after the infill, and they found, I think there was like 20 mil settlement in one span, and maybe might have been 50 mil settlement in the next span. And in the south span, they found that it hadn't been infilled at all. There was nothing in there. So they'd been managing, they'd infilled it, and the assumption therefore is, right, we've infilled it, this is now a CS454 pass, so it can take 40 tons, but the active travel group who wanted to put a greenway under there, one of their members went back, had a look at the bridge and thought, oh, it's a big hole here. He was able to get through this hole under the span, and there was no infill at all. The Jacobs progress reports said south span infilled, but it was.
Yeah, sorry, I was just, I'll probably have to forgot what I was going to say. First, I just wanted to mention my old colleague Bill Harden. Sadly no longer with us, but Bill, made his life out of heritage structures. If he was here today, I'm sure he would say something like, "It's almost impossible to destroy a masonry arch bridge." Especially if you look after it. It's fortunate, I suppose, that the final stage of the infill process wasn't knocking through the remains of the old arch, which is what used to happen quite a few places. The other thing I'll point out was picking up over here earlier on. I don't think engineering degrees, civil engineering degrees, have ever had much to say about heritage structures, and that was the reason why British rail engineers, and I suspect British waterways engineers as well, their young graduates went through a 3-year training scheme, during which time they went around all of the departments, and learned how to look after old structures from people who had been doing it for 30 or 40 years, and stuff that would actually horrify the uninitiated in terms of condition. The old stagers would say, yeah, that's all right, that'll last another 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is. Lick of paint, bit of mortar, but if you've not got that experience, what have you got to fall back on when you see a problem? The answer is, well, take the safe route. That's where we are.
Bill was very encouraging during our campaign. I had lots of interactions with Bill, and I remember him sending me a collection of photographs. There must have been some destructive tests done on masonry arch bridges back in the 80s. And I think it was a canal bridge that they basically tried to destroy. And he showed me these pictures of, basically bridges with big holes in. But this masonry arch bridge was still able to carry 80 tons or 100 tons, despite the fact that much of it has been destroyed. Masonry arch bridges are hugely resilient.
It's too hard.
David, you
I thought Nick was going to mention that the Institution of Civil Engineers now has the CARE registration scheme, So there is a scheme there, but it is not well known about. And it's certainly not something that a client has to specify that his engineers have that qualification before they touch historic structures.
Yes. I'd like to think, but I don't know, that the engineers recruited into the Historical Railways estate team would have that kind of, yeah, I don't know.
In terms of education, recently I've become aware of the fact that some of the technical institutes in the North East have formed partnerships with the Community Rail Partnership movement, which is an interesting one because of course CRPs are concerned with live railways, not heritage railways. I wondered if you've got any comments on that or whether there's something that could be built on there.
It's not something I've ever given any, I wasn't aware of that. You may be right, maybe that is a possibility.
Well, thank you very much for answering those questions. Been very useful addition to it. A fascinating talk. I'm very grateful to you for coming here and telling us. It will effectively be history itself, I think.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Safe journey home, and I look forward to seeing you at our next lecture. I think this is your last slide of the waterside viaduct. Is that at risk?
No.
No.
No, that's
What?
oh, thank you very much. It's sort of
Jeff there in your room. Jeff Bittner,
he was. I went to his funeral, sadly.
good friend of mine.
He was the guy who actually created